Hi, I'm Charlene Collins Freeman, and welcome to my tutorial for understanding how to capture values with watercolors. Value is the degree of light and dark of a color. Artists use value to create contrast and to add visual interest to our work. And it is value that helps us create the illusion of three-dimensionality and of distance in our work. It's value that will give your forms a sense of volume. Learning to see value is a challenging skill. I like to start with thinking about value in just three different shades. We have a light, a middle, and a dark. If you can look at a scene or at a reference image and identify which shapes are light, which ones are middle tone, and which ones are dark, you'll already be able to start creating a sense of volume and three-dimensionality in your work. In other mediums, artists will add white to a paint to make it lighter and add black or gray or brown to make it darker. But in watercolors, we play with the water to paint ratio. Here I'm creating swatches of the three values, light, middle, and dark. That first example is done with indigo. The darker a paint is, such as indigo, the more values you can get out of it. Now I'm using burnt sienna, and you see I start off with a very watery mix for my light value. I add more pigment to that paint and I get a middle value. And for my darkest value, I'm painting almost with dry watercolor. Watercolor does need to have a little bit of water on it to be activated, to be able to pick it up with your brush and lay it down on paper. But using as little water as possible will give you the darkest value of any paint you're using. Here I'm doing the same exercise with cadmium red, medium hue. If these swatches start looking similar and the value is not apparent to have a shift from light to dark, you can always add in more paint while that shape is damp, or you can wait until it totally dries and then come in and do a second layer. This will help you achieve darker values. For this last swatch, I'm using Hansa Yellow Light. Since yellows are such light colors, it's really difficult to get more than three values out of them. Once you get comfortable playing with that water to paint ratio and achieving light, middle, and dark values, the next skill to build up is actually seeing them in your subject or in your reference photo. Here you can see me picking up the little bead of paint that is accumulating on the edge of some of these swatches. I'm using a thirsty brush to do that, just running it along that bead and using that brush almost more like a sponge to pick that up. And here are my swatches. Try to think in terms of three values, light, middle, and dark, as you start approaching building this skill. Eventually, you'll be able to play with your water to paint ratio enough to create 5 or 6 values. But in the early stages, I recommend just focusing on 3. And the same is true when it comes to picking a subject and understanding how to paint it. It's easy for us to look at the colors, but as artists, we want to see past the colors and understand the values. I recommend trying to break down a scene or a reference image into the same 3 values of light, middle, and dark. For this demonstration, I want to use this photograph that I took one winter in Verona, Italy. As we look at this image, we can easily identify the colors, but understanding the values is a little bit trickier. So one way to approach this skill is to first convert your image to black and white. By removing the color, now I can really focus on just the degree of lightness to darkness. This is a great way to start understanding value and start seeing value. There are artists who do this throughout their whole career with their reference photos, working from a black and white version as well as from a color version, so that they can more accurately depict both color and value. And to eliminate the confusion of color, I recommend painting monochromatic studies. Monochromatic means painting with one color. This ensures that I can just stay focused on values. I'm doing a quick sketch of my reference image. I will paint my monochromatic sketch with indigo. Since indigo is my darkest color, I'm ensuring that I have some really strong light, middle, and dark values. I'm not spending too much time with a detailed drawing. I really just want to capture the biggest shapes I see. With sketching, I like the idea, the philosophy that many sketchers have, that we're not recreating the scene realistically. This isn't a miniature hyper-realistic painting, but rather I want to capture just the essence of the place, or the essence of the subject that I sketch. The video is playing at twice the speed at which I was drawing, but I don't think I spent more than 20 minutes drawing this scene. Monochromatic paintings like this can help an artist understand the values of a scene and can be used as a preparatory study, but I think that they're quite beautiful as finished sketches all on their own. And with that, I'm ready to start painting. I give myself a little notation at the bottom of my sketch to remember that I want to focus on light, middle, and dark values. Since watercolors are a transparent medium, it's most common to start with our lightest values. We can always paint dark on top of them. However, if we paint the dark values first, it's hard to lighten them up if later we decide we went too dark. You can see just how watery my indigo is on my page. I'm trying to capture some of the lightest tones I see. It's hard sometimes to identify what is the lightest tone, what is a middle tone, and what is a dark tone. One bit of advice that you will hear commonly is squint at your subject. And if you squint at my reference photo, what you'll see is that a lot of the details go away. What really stands out are the lightest shapes and the darkest shapes. The lightest shape of this image is that sky shape. It's almost in the shape of the letter T. Then the next lightest shape is the street that approaches that sky shape. The darkest shapes are in the buildings themselves, namely right underneath the roof line and the plants on the left-hand edge and at the end of the right-hand row of homes. And you can see I'm sort of tiptoeing up to my darkest darks. I don't go straight in with the darkest values. I paint those light values, and then I start building up middle values. I build up slowly and I save the darks for last. I'm really just working with one puddle of paint in my palette, as you can see. When I need a much lighter form of indigo, I just take a little bit out from that puddle and I add water to it, like you've seen me do right now. If, on the other hand, I need it to be darker, I just dip a little bit more indigo paint into that puddle. Some artists prefer to make 3 puddles, one really watery for their light values, one less watery for their middle values, and one fairly thick for their dark values. Whatever works for you, there's no one way of doing this. So I always find it easiest to start off by painting the lightest areas I see. Keep in mind that in some scenes and with some subjects, the lightest area you see might actually be white. And for that, I leave the white of the paper. Then I still paint with 3 more values. I still use a light, a middle, and a dark, but I really will be creating 4 values on my page, since one value will be the white of the paper. Then as I start working up towards the darks, I go in with that middle value. Since we're just working with 3 values, you could decide to paint everything that's not the lightest value in this middle tone. And then once that's dry, come in and do dark tones where you see darker values. That would be one way to approach this. I'm going back and forth between middle values and dark values all at the same time. One reason that capturing values correctly is challenging is because values are relative. What I mean by that is that when you make a mark, for example, on a white piece of paper, you might feel that that mark is really dark, but that's only because you're comparing it to the rest of the paper, which is completely white. However, that mark will start looking much lighter as you paint darker values around it. So what that means for our sketching and our painting is that sometimes you'll feel that you've painted a certain area in your sketch the right value. For example, I'm looking at that building on my left-hand side, and originally I thought that roof was exactly the right value. But it's relative to what else I'm painting in. As I've started painting in the darkest darks, that roof starts to look more pale than it looked before I put in all the darks. And so that means that as we build up our values, we have to go back and reassess the areas we've already painted and decide if they need to get darker or they might have to get lighter. So when you hear terms like values are relative and also colors are relative, what that really means is that the way our eye perceives them changes as we build up the painting or the sketch around them. They start to look different to us, and we have to be willing to go back in and make adjustments as we build up our sketch. Now you can see I've darkened that roof, and the value looks more accurate. However, the building underneath the roof now has started to look too light. So there's this dance of going back and forth as you build up values, trying to get them in as well as you can. You don't have to capture it exactly, but the more you capture what's in front of you, the more you'll be able to capture the three-dimensional sense of the scene and often even the mood of the scene. If we don't have much of a contrast in our work between light, middle, and dark, we'll find that our sketches and our paintings look pretty flat instead of looking rounded, three-dimensional, or volumetric. And you can see me going back and again to areas that I thought were the right value, but they now look lighter because I've added darker areas, or they're lighter because watercolor often fades as it dries. So there is a lot of back and forth on this. I really enjoy the process, and the best way I can do this is I put my reference image next to my sketch and my eyes go back and forth, squinting at both my reference image and at my sketch to see if I'm capturing the same value shift. Of course, if you're working from life, a scene in front of you, a still life, or you're sitting outside somewhere and trying to capture a scene, you won't have the help of a black and white photograph of it. If you want to capture from life, you can still use the squinting technique. Squinting, whether you're looking at a black and white photograph or looking at a scene in front of you, really does help to eliminate details, which can add to the confusion of what we're seeing. And when you're squinting, whether it's at a reference photo or a scene in front of you, what you really want to look for is the biggest shapes of what you're looking at and their value. What's the lightest? What's middle? What's dark? With practice, you'll be able to start seeing values more. And also you'll be able to look at your sketch or your painting and judge where you might need to go darker or where you might need to lift out some paint. And remember, you don't have to just stay true to your reference photo or to the scene in front of you. You can adjust the values to suit you, to capture the scene the way you want to remember it. So here's my final of my monochromatic sketch of this scene in Verona. I hope you have found this tutorial useful, and as always, thank you for joining me.